Jay, thanks for joining me today.
Thank
Super
thank you for
excited to
having
have
me.
you on.
Thank you. I'm excited to be on. Like I said, I'm a fan of this program, so it's an honor to be a speaker now.
Brilliant. Yeah, in the hot seat now. In the hot seat now. Well, you've been through the worst of it, which is the mic switching off, so that always happens. That's the. Um, why are so many people fascinated with tactical periodization, Jay?
Um, it's a good question. I think just because of the success that coaches at the highest level have been studying this methodology and applying this methodology, mainly coaches from Portugal, and you see their success that's all over the world. If you start, the most known is Jose Mourinho, who had success for a long time in different countries, and he's kind of the guy who brought tactical periodization into the coaching world per se, based on his academics from the University of Porto and the professor behind him. And then other coaches went through the same similar academic stream and got success. If you look at people like Vitor Pereira, who was successful in Greece and in China, and André Villas-Boas, who just finished second in Marseille. So there's many coaches that have been used the methodology and got success. So I think it's um, it's definitely something that people can say, here's something, and here's the after of it, which is the success, right?
Hmm. Brilliant, brilliant. Do you want to go in and give us a little bit of, I suppose, background to your set of background to the basics of the methodology, and then, like I said, I'll chime in with a few questions when we get going.
Yeah, no problem. So I guess my background is in the methodology. First, I'm a student of the methodology. By no means I'm a no expert. I respect the methodology because it takes years to study and a lot of work to understand. So I'm a very ambitious and driven student of the methodology. My experience with the methodology is started working at the Ottawa Fury with Coach Mark Dos Santos and Philip Dos Santos. Mark was the first team head coach, and Philip was the assistant and technical director of the academy. And I worked very close with Philip and got good access on a daily basis with Mark Dos Santos with the first team in everything from training structure, methodology, everything, because their background is from Porto, so they got to spend multiple encounters with Professor Vitor Frade, who is the guy who pretty much invented the methodology. So they spent a lot of time with him, learning and studying, and they took that and started to apply it here in their reality. So I got to spend a good 2 years with them on a daily basis, learning the application of the methodology and the why and the stuff behind it. In 2018, I continued my methodology study from there, and I said I want to go to the source. So in 2016, I took a Portuguese course here in Ottawa at the college to learn the language because I wanted to make sure that when I learn the methodology, I want to learn it genuine. I don't want to have translations and misunderstandings. So I learned the language, and then in 2018, through lots of networking and connections, I was able to go to FC Porto in their academy and spend time with the academy staff to see the methodology in its truest form implemented on a daily basis. And I got to spend time with coaches and debrief with a lot of good coaches that are in their academy. And once I was there, I thought, hey, a lot of coaches came through this academy. They worked in the academy, worked their way up. Some maybe to first team, and some went to other clubs. But this is the home. This is the source. So I picked up a lot of knowledge and a lot of good contacts from there that I continue to dialogue on a daily basis on learning more about the methodology and continue that academic background and my application in my reality here in Ottawa. And I got to do that when I worked in the academy. So I would take the stuff I learned and then implement it in the evening with my groups, overseeing by the technical director and sometimes first team coach. So that's kind of my background in the methodology.
Brilliant. Whenever you're looking at these environments, I mean, what's the starting point, I suppose? Is it I mean, because I think a lot of what we hear, and I've read a fair amount on tactical periodization, but I've also read a lot of articles where there seems to be a discrepancy of that's not, especially from Vitor Friday, that's not, the technically the right way to do it. So is the starting point the game model? Is there an area before that, or what's the process around it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I kind of had the same question when I did a coaching internship in Fenerbahce in 2016 or 2015. The first team head coach was Vitor Pereira, and a lot of his stuff trickled down into the academy. So I was able to ask that question, and it's a question that doesn't really have a direct, clear answer, but more or less it is the game model. Because before you start anything, there has to be an idea, the game model. What's my idea as a coach, and what do I want to implement before I can even talk about morphocycle and principles? I have to have the game model idea. And one thing I've been finding about this term game model that's being thrown around a lot lately, and I think is a very loose term per se that's being used. It's not specific enough. I think that people use the term game model, and I'll sit down with some people and they say, okay, this is our game model, but they're pretty much explaining to me football. Like it's too generic. It's too for example, I want to dominate central areas, and then later in their game model they say I want to dominate the width. But you can't have everything. There has to be a specific, clear identity and a clear game model, and I think that takes time and it takes a lot of effort. So you have to break it down. Game model. Here's my idea. And then we talk about the 4 moments of the game: offensive organization, transition from offense to defense, defensive organization, and transition defense to offense. So we start there with those 4 moments of the game, and then we go even one level deeper. So we say, okay, what's our major principle for these 4 moments? And a major principle could be something like dominating possession, for example. It's generic, but there's still some context to it. And then we could dive in one level deeper, which is our sub principles, which become not so much collective, but sectorial and intersectorial. So if you think of midfielders or midfielders' relationship with center backs, so then your details have to come on that level. What do I want from these groups? That becomes my sub principles. And then we can even take it one depth further, which is our sub principles, which could become kind of individual per se. So we talk a lot about attitudes and behaviors. For example, in transition, we can talk about the behaviors of transition of these players. And in an exercise, if I'm talking about the behaviors of transitions, I'm talking about sub principles. So that's kind of where you start. You have to outline all of that stuff before you can even go into building everything else and applying the methodologies, having that detailed, specific game model.
Yeah, like consistency of. I completely agree with game models being very general and generic. I spoke to a mentorship group yesterday, and that's what we were kind of talking about was everyone really wants to play the game the same way in terms of like the aesthetics of it, possession soccer, high tempo, preferably win the ball high, blah blah blah. But I mean, where do coaches or how much differentiation is there in people having people who use tactical periodization, but then they also have different systems within that? I mean, how flexible is the methodology?
Yeah, because people sometimes could mistaken or misinterpret game model for system. I think in the literature and the education that I've got, nowhere in the game model per se is we're talking about systems as of yet. I think the system is supplementary to the game model, because I could more or less have a similar game model in a 4-3-3 and a 4-4-2. So I think the system is something supplementary. And one thing that I heard the other day doing a webinar with Vitor Pereira, he talked about the game model being a living organism. It's always evolving and growing. And he talked about his experience in Greece and in Turkey and in China. The game model had to evolve, and if you look at those coaches, sometimes within the week, games could be different. They could be in a 4-4-2, they could be in a 4-4-3, but you still see those elements of those game models there. It's very clear. It's very identified. And if we talk about the game model, it's more like collective and individual intentions rather than, again, like you said, a system of play.
Mm. A couple of people have already asked this here, and
Yeah.
I was going to ask it as well about the science because, well, two things I want to ask. Number one, Fergus Connolly, I listened to something Fergus was saying and Fergus has been over in his research for his books and has taught the Vitor Friday and has met with a couple of top guys there, and he said that they basically looked at intensity and they done a red for like high intensity, green for low intensity, and yellow for medium intensity exercises, and they pulled a lot of the yellow stuff. So it was high or it was low, but it was no like in between. I mean, how does that work in terms of aligning? Because we've got so much information now towards coaches with GPS and stuff. I mean, how much is the methodology aligned to the physical?
Yeah, it has a very, very detailed approach when it comes to the physical component of the game, and inside the methodology, and you see that it's clear that Vitor Frad brought that to the methodology and to the world of football, that the training the physical component inside a football context. And if you look at the science behind it, they do work in intensities, and I find that's another word that in the English language is very gray. Like, you can use that word intensity in so many different contexts. But if you talk about intensities, the way they work, the science component on the physical side is the acquisition days. So there's something called the morphocycle, which is the week cycle broken down from game to the next game. And inside that are different days that contribute to the physical component. There's always an active recovery day. I'm talking about one game a week because once we dive into 2 or 3 games a week, it changes completely. But if we stick to the traditional one game a week, you have an active recovery day, you have a strength day, you have an endurance day, and you have a speed day. And the intensities are adjusted to each of those days. So the science is always different. So, for example, on a strength day, if we think about traditional strength, there's people in the gym doing deadlifts or squats and things like this. But inside the methodology, where they get the strength in a football context is on the field. So when they're building an exercise and it's a day of strength, it's very high density, and it's a lot of acceleration, deceleration. It's a lot of change of direction. It's duels, it's jumping, it's shooting. A lot of muscular contractions that give a lot of tension to the muscles. So that way they'll get the strength component that's directly related to the game, not strength in a gym that you could do that has no context or not really related to playing. But you develop an exercise that pulls these scientific components out of acceleration, deceleration, and that's the art of coaching. It's hard. It's very hard. So you have to sit there and build an exercise, and the things you have to take into consideration is the size, the dimension, the duration, the rest periods, and the number of players. So, for example, on a strength day, you would do small sets but longer rests because it's very demanding on muscular contractions, because they're turning, they're pivoting, they're engaging in contact with, they're doing duels, for example. I know shooting is one of the most demanding football actions out there. So it causes a lot of stress, but you pull out the strength component of the player. So you get to work strength in a football context and always around your game model. So whatever exercise you built, you have to think of all of these things. You have to think of, like I said, the dimension, the size, the duration, rest period, recovery. Am I getting acceleration? Am I getting deceleration? Am I getting change of directions? Is it related to my game model? So it's a lot of detail, but this is the art of coaching, and this is what makes coaching very, very detailed and and difficult at the end of the day. But that's where you as a coach comes out, you as a person.
That's where you have to work as a coach.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because it's easy, and I see all the time. It's today I can just go to YouTube and type in Pep Guardiola exercise and yank it off, which is I'm not saying it's a no, but um, it's not related to you, and the reason you don't know all the details when Guardiola was designing that exercise, what components he was putting in. Now you could take that idea and say, I like it. Let me tailor it to my game model, what I want to get out of the training, to my reality. But you can't just take and pull, because it doesn't. You're not working really, right? It's a process to build a weekly cycle, and a training session and an exercise. It's a process.
yeah, but part of this here problem I think we have over here in the US is that when we say intensity, we think physical intensity, which is
Hmm.
how do we schedule? And we've already got a couple here, and that's like I get it. Everyone is in the phase of how do I've got 2 games in a week, and I've college this here and clubs that there, but we've got heart rates coming out of our like so much information technology we don't even use half of it. But there's not very when you go to these exercises and you go to training centers and you go to these great facilities that we have. I know you work in the US as well. There's not a lot of thinking going on. So how important is the mental intensity in the methodology that goes alongside producing players that can it, process information, think collectively, not just individually?
Yeah, it's huge, and Vitor Frad also put that inside the methodology, and added that part as well to make it a collective methodology. If we go back to the acquisition days inside your cycle, so like I said, you have active recovery, specific strength, specific speed, specific endurance. In all of those, you have a physical component. You're obviously getting a technical component. You're obviously working a tactical component, but there's you could use the word emotional or psychosocial component, which is affecting the players as well, and that you have to think about as a coach. I'll give an example. A game inside the methodology, based on Professor Vitor Frad, he says that a game is super emotional load. It's stressful. There's if you have fans, there's fans. You're getting kicked in the ankle. I'm bruised. I'm bleeding. Coach is screaming at me. My teammates are screaming at me. I won. I lost. So there's all this emotion in the game, which is why inside tactical periodization methodology they give the day after day off. Now I know in science, and I'm a big Raymond Verheyen guy as well. In science and all this stuff, they say that the day after should be a recovery day. But in here, the way they look at it, we're dealing with humans at the end of the day, right? So they take into consideration all the emotional load and stress from the game, day off the next game to bring that stuff down, and then active recovery becomes the following day. And same thing in your exercises and your training sessions. You have to think of when you're building the exercise, the emotional load, and only your reality, whether it's U9 boys, U14 girls, professional men. You have to take into consideration that your players and what kind of emotional load and stress is going to bring these players. For example, in a specific endurance day, so we're talking about big spaces, a lot of players, longer sets, short rests on an endurance day. So you have to think inside those sets. Let's say you're playing, doing an exercise 2 times 10 minutes. So for 10 minutes, the players are thinking of the game, decision making, communicating, scanning, observing, collating information. That's emotional load and emotional stress. So we have to think in the exercises, in the training sessions that we're building, what kind of volume am I giving on that sense to the players? I can't kill them, but I also can't do an exercise where they have no emotional load. And if we talk about the day of active recovery, they've come from a day off. Maybe they spent with their families. Maybe they went to school, homework. I don't know. But so still the active recovery day. You're not jumping in right away to heavy emotional load. So you're doing kind of fun games a lot of people do at the beginning, like soccer, tennis, and then 3v3 with short sets, sorry, with longer rests, and not a lot of coaching. In the active recovery days, one thing that I learned in the application from coaching mentors that I worked with is you don't need to be in the players' ears on active recovery day, because they just had a day off, and the day before that they had a stressful game. So you're kind of gradually building up the week in terms of the emotional load as well. The same thing you're doing the physical load. Usually your highest acquisition day comes in midweek, right? But same thing with the emotional load. You're still kind of building that emotional load throughout the week, and then it tapers off, because the day before the game, you don't want to be pounding the players in their ear, in their face, this, that, right? You want them to come to game day feeling good and feeling good physically, good emotionally, and going into the game.
Yeah, it's surely it's the type of decision as well, because there's no point in having a intensity in decision making. You mentioned head tennis, like the decision is that the ball's got to stay in the lines and stuff. Like
Yeah.
that's not related to the game. Like it's not a tactical decision. So surely when we're setting up our training with tactical periodization, we should be exposing our, like, for me, I just feel as if we've completely gone physical more than tactical. And maybe you can disagree with me, but I think that's where we are as a culture, where we're way over on the other side physical, but yet players are not thinking their way through training sessions and not getting exposed. So when they get games, they've got overexposure to decisions, both individually and in the framework of what they're trying to do tactically, and it doesn't work. And then people think that it didn't work, or people say it doesn't work because they weren't fit enough, quick enough, 2 games in 2 or 3 days, didn't get enough recovery. How do you know the difference between if your team were fatigued physically or if your team just mentally aren't prepared?
Yeah, it's I going back to what you said earlier, is we sometimes in programs or environments we tend to really focus on one element, and therefore the other element goes down. If we talk about physical and tactical, inside tactical periodization, all those concepts are trained inside your daily training environment. If we talk about physical, emotional, tactical, technical, all those are there because inside of a game, those concepts are synchronized. They're interwoven in 90 minutes. It's not isolated, right? So inside the tactical periodization, it's why are we isolating outside of the game on training days? So for example, we're getting the physical component, we're getting the emotional, all that inside your training, your training environment. And a good quote that I've heard is like, football is more of the sum of its parts. So if you can't just break down part by part by part and then put back together on game day and then break, because like I said, it's all synchronized, it's all interwoven. In the game, they're at the same time that they're running, I'm having an emotional load because I'm thinking of, I don't know, where the defender's coming and where my run is going to be, and maybe I have the ball, so I have to think about my touch. All those things are interwoven, so you have to train that way, because I can't just break it down and train in isolation. On top of that, there's not enough time. Even if you train 5 times a week, it's not enough time if you take into consideration the recovery. And I think a lot of things that I see is we don't take into consideration or don't value enough recovery. I think everyone's about this intensity. Let's go, bam, bam, bam. My team has to be this word fittest, and we're all about intensity. But you can't ignore or neglect recovery. And at the end of the day, we do have technologies, with GPS and all these other technologies. And it also comes your feel as a coach and knowing your players and speaking to them. In the Ottawa Fury, we had a program. So players arrived every day. It was called Coach Me Plus, and it was like a questionnaire. How did you sleep? Do you have any soreness in any parts of your body? So we're collecting that information to learn about the players, so we can help them, because some players are their biology is different. Some players have faster muscle fibers, so we have to think about maybe in the training session, if I'm doing today 4 times 3 minutes in a speed day, and I know that this player here is having problems recovery or his injury, he only does 2 sets. So we have to know our players, but also keep them in that context, because we can easily stray away and start doing too much physical or things like this. So we always have to keep it inside this idea that it's all collective, it's all interwoven, it's all synchronized, because that's the game.
Yeah, I'm going to be careful how I word this. On the Because again, you've mentioned for Verheyen, and there's a couple of questions for Verheyen versus Friday. What are the similarities? I'm going to ask you about that there, but like one of the things I think that hamstrings our coaching community, even in college, even in tough environments, to balance the physical loading, is that we manage teams and judge success based on injury records. So when you keep because there's this sentence, and I don't know where it's come from, but if you keep your best, fittest players, if you get your best players healthy, you'll win your game. You have a better chance to win your game. But not if it's a development age and you're actually just trying to keep people where they are and recover and going recover and recover. Surely there's got to be that you're actually trying to make players better. So surely whenever you're trying to trade a training session and after 4 minutes the quality starts to drop, after 6 minutes of a football match the quality starts to drop as well. So should they not be able to play through that there? Like is there not a level of getting through the actually, when does the game become realistic as opposed to theoretical for the coach? I'm not sure if it made any sense there, but that's what I see as a big drawback here.
Yeah, if I think I understand your question correctly, again, it just relates back to covering all of those things inside the tactical periodization methodology. And I'm a big Raymond Verheyen guy too. I've done a lot of his courses, and I posed the same question to him. I threw it out one day and I said, you know, tactical periodization, what are your thoughts? And Raymond, being the character that he is, didn't really give me a straight answer, because I was waiting for a straight answer, and didn't give me a really straight answer, but kind of threw it back on me. And also too, he said, look, we could talk days and days and days, but he does respect the methodology from our conversation. And I do know the familiarity I have for both methodologies. Like I said, I'm not an expert, but I do see a lot of similarities. And I guess we can identify the one is training everything and your loads and you know, especially if you're talking about development ages and maybe you only have contact time with your players 3 times a week, why wouldn't you do a training session and build training exercises that cover all of those? Why would you only do something that people call technical exercise with no other first, no context to your game model and no other components to football, because you don't have enough time. So why would you not take the time to incorporate and build a training session and exercises that a term that we use and I've been taught is rich in content. Make it as rich as possible with your game model. If you're talking about, okay, today I'm doing my session is offensive organization principles, but I have to add a transition element because one doesn't exist without the other, and I'm going to make sure that there's a good physical load with enough recovery time and a lot of decision making in the exercise and making sure that the players are involved and getting some touches and there's a tactical, all these things. Why wouldn't you do that if you only have certain contact time with your players? So I think if it's just a commitment, it's a commitment, like you said, and it's knowing your environment. If your environment and your reality is the game goes sideways in 6 minutes, maybe you're constrained to that environment, but at least make the most and the best of your training environment by training as much as you can. And you start to build the loads. You start to see that the quality doesn't dip after 4 minutes on a strength day, and maybe you could tweak it and push it an extra 30 seconds. Obviously not going into too much and making it not become a strength exercise, but still staying in the boundaries of the principles of that acquisition day. But you start to build, and it's just knowing your environment, but really, really trying to apply the methodology. Because like I said, it's a lot of work. It's very, very time consuming and emotional consuming as a coach to make sure that you are applying the methodology as much as you can based on your reality.
Yeah, very interesting. Why do you think Jose took away the heart rate monitors at Manchester United? Like, and not to go down controversy, but like, what would be a reason why you would he would have done that there, in your opinion?
Not knowing the background and context, I do know that Jose Mourinho had in Chelsea and in Real Madrid and in most of his career up until now, assistant coach named Rui Faria, who was always around him, and another big tactical periodization student and understands the methodology, which is why Mourinho had him as his right hand man, bring him around, and he was very, very heavily involved in the physical component and the tactical periodization implementation. Um, Maybe because you know players have been accustomed to something for so long that in their head they have something programmed. I'll give an example that I can relate to. Maybe people can relate to as well. If you work with a coach or a technical director or GM or whomever that has been in the game for 20 years and they're used to something, their education and what they've been doing, it's hard to break that. And I think the same goes for players. Um, I saw in a webinar I did on tactical periodization, the guy put a photo of Man United and they were doing just like running, just like and their fitness coach with a watch, and Ryan Giggs also had a watch, and he was running with them, and it was we were pretty much talking about, but where's the context in that? What are they doing? So maybe the Man United players were used to something so long that in their head, when they see the heart rate monitor results, their head goes to something, and maybe it's correct, maybe it's incorrect, but maybe Mourinho didn't want them to think that way when they saw it. So maybe he said, "Okay, I need to take this away from them because if they see something and they think something, maybe they'll go in the gym and do, I don't know, 100 squats, and then they come to training next day and they're sore and they can't perform." Maybe that's the first thing that comes to mind. I don't know. But that's probably something that comes to mind because I do see it a lot. Once you're accustomed to something and you're used to something, your mind automatically goes there because that's the way you were brought up or that's the way you only know. And when someone new comes about, it's hard to. It puts you in that uncomfortable setting, as if we're going to quote Raymond Verheyen, who used those words, uncomfortableness.
I know you're a very respectful coach, and I really appreciate that. So this is not again to go down bashing, but like I'm a massive Jose fan. Now there's and again without understanding his environments and not, but a criticism has come in that Jose has not evolved tactically over the past how many years. That's not what we're going to discuss. What I want to ask you is like how much has tactical periodization evolved in the last 10 years because there's so many changes in the game, or where has it evolved?
I think it's the principles are always going to be the principles of the methodology. If you talk about the acquisition days, the morpho cycle, how you build an exercise, talking about loads. I think those are going to be there because that's the science behind it, and it is what it is. I think where the evolution comes, because Vitor Frad had this idea well before even Mourinho got to implement it in Porto and Chelsea. He was well ahead of his time. And you can even say, okay, if you take Mourinho out of the question, and other coaches that applied this methodology into their teams, but they get success too. I think it was in 2017 or 2016, there was 6 or 7 coaches that pretty much are understudies of Vitor Frad, won the championships in their respective country, whether it was in Greece, in China, or wherever the places were. I can't remember all of them. But you see that there is still success. Now, I think where the evolution comes is the game model. And that's why I earlier on I said, and Vitor Pereira is one who said this, that the game model is a living organism. It's got to evolve because tactics are evolving and different principles are evolving. If you look at coaches in I'll use Nagelsmann as an example, bringing something different in terms of tactical ideas. So I think your game model is that living organism that's constantly evolving. but the principles of the methodology in terms of training structure and how you construct an exercise, and starting from game model and your weekly cycle and the acquisition days, I think those are non-negotiables when it comes to applying the methodology. And in my opinion, another interesting quote that relates to this, and again from this webinar I did with Vitor Pereira, he said every season he leaves this book of training exercises behind. Whether he stays at the club or he leaves the club, he leaves it there, because he said, this is not used to me anymore. Because the next season, I may have different players. I might be in a different league. The other teams will have different players. And obviously this is at the highest level, right? And he used an example of big signings that clubs, if they come in and add if they come in and add a player like Oscar, but that changes your game model, your team dynamic, right? If you didn't have an Oscar before. So he said he leaves all those behind because it's not relatable to the next season. And I think that also too ties into that job of a coach, taking in all those parts of the methodology and building an exercise, building a morphocycle, building a training session, taking in all these factors of the physical component, the emotional component, my game model. Because it's easy just to take, let me copy again. Okay, last season, okay, I did this again. You start to dip into that comfort zone. But in the tactical periodization methodology, like I said, you have to think of all these things. All of these things. The principles stay the same, but you have to take your reality, and the application part goes. And that's where it comes down to, it's got to be creative to you. Your exercises, your training session, based on all your reality, all your circumstances, all your resources. Everyone's different. Everyone is different.
Brilliant. Okay, I'll take a couple of questions from the crowd here. What's the one I highlighted? Brian in Fresno. What components would Frad also admit that there is a higher need for in isolation, especially at the higher levels?
From my understanding in my education inside the methodology, it's doing as much as you can inside without isolating. Like I said, so you're going physical, tactical, technical, emotional, or psychosocial, however you want to word it, inside your training sessions and training exercises. Now, I had a conversation with a coach who applies tactical periodization and was a student of Professor Vitor Frad. And he said that his approach, and again, this is based on his reality, on some days they have to do these things they call top-ups. If they didn't get enough, I'll use a specific example. If they didn't get enough on the strength day, if they found that maybe the players didn't get enough on the strength day, that they'll do a top-up, which they'll do some football sprints. Always staying inside a context, there's a ball, there's some sort of objective, but just topping up a little bit more in the physical component. And that's where I think you can do things in isolation. But inside the methodology, like I said, you have to do everything inside your training environment and train all of those things. And if you don't think you can, you have to think, okay, how can I? If my players aren't getting enough emotional load, how can I add another emotional load? For example, if I'm doing an exercise that's a 6v4, and I'm working on the 6 in an offensive organization in the final third, and I find that there's not enough emotional load here, I could easily, once the ball's out of play, whether it's a shot over the net or the ball went out, I could have a second ball in my hand ready to throw in as a transition element. So I'm getting a transition element. I'm getting randomness and chaotic moments, because in football there is randomness and chaotic moments. That's why the methodology in the game model is termed as complex. And I'm also getting that emotional load, because I can throw the ball anywhere. I could throw it up in the air. I could throw it to the defending team, attacking team, striker, center back, keeper. So they have to react. And that's emotional because the ball just went out. Maybe I just spent 45 seconds of high defending. And now I got to identify where the ball is, work with my team, and not concede the goal in the exercise. So that's just an example of how I can top up inside my exercise, and whether it's I structured at the beginning or maybe I felt it throughout the exercise, and that just comes with your art of coaching and comfortableness with the methodology and with your own game model.
A lot of people are asking, like, where do I start? And obviously you mentioned it. Yeah, I mean, with in terms of courses, without, I'm sure there are one or two that are reluctant in terms of time and education to go and learn Portuguese to go over there. I mean, what English resources would be best for them? Good.
I don't know because I'm not familiar with all of them in terms of if they're things that are inside. Like I said at the beginning, there's a lot of misunderstanding and things that are lost in translation, for example. So it's hard. It's really hard. I do know that there is. I think if they go online, there's like we mentioned before, Vitor Frade runs a course directly from him, and there is an English component, but I'm not really familiar with it. But like I said, it's really hard to find, here's a document or here's a book that I got, and it's really hard for me to say that everything in that book is 100% accurate, unless Professor Vitor Frade wrote it himself in English. But where to start, I think it's honestly, it's hard. I think it's a lot of different things. I think maybe even reading up on the content and learning about the stuff, yes, and then filtering out and maybe speaking to people that have studied under Professor Vitor Frade or have been in contact with him, because maybe they'll have the same problem and they got some questions answered. It's hard, but I think, yeah, it's very hard to answer that question on where to start in terms of the education. I was blessed and fortunate enough to work and have coaching mentors that study directly under Professor Vitor Frade, and was fortunate enough to go to FC Porto and things like that. So I understand where you're coming from and understand your frustration and trying to where to start. It's but I don't have a clear answer, unfortunately.
That's what should be. Shouldn't be too easy for people to find. Okay. A couple of people have asked about the emotional and social focus. I mean, where can they get better at, or where can you get more resources maybe on their side of it, or is there more research being done on that side of it?
In terms of like your players, like working your players emotionally,
yes, yeah.
Not really, because at the end of the day, it comes down to you, your reality, and your game model. And I think when we talk about emotional and psychosocial, if I'll give you an example, communication is a part of that, because if I'm working with my back four, I'm having a psychosocial interaction, and there's an emotional component to it because there's information being fed to me, or I'm feeding information, and information is being divulged in this. So that's a part of an emotional load, and decision making. And this is another term that's used a lot today. Of course, your exercises have to have some decision making component to it, and that's an emotional and psychosocial load that you give your players. And it could be, one that came about to me. I was in a really, really awkward situation where the teams were outnumbered, and the coach said to me, put all the best players on the team that has the low numbers, because you're going to make them think, now, how do we solve this problem where we're down a player, and the game is not going to be really blown out if maybe one team has more players than the other. It's still kind of because of their quality, maybe they're the higher end players, but giving them that extra little bit of emotional and psychosocial component load of decision making. Of we're already playing a game, we have so many other decisions and so many other problems to focus on trying to win this game, but I also have another load in the back of my mind that I'm down a player, and this stays within reality of the game, because in games you could go down a player, whether it's red card or whether it's injury, right? So you're still staying inside the concepts of the game, but doing things like that to give your players a little bit more emotional load.
Question from Jed. Thanks, obviously, thanks for everything, blah, 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 blah. Is there any information on tactical periodization that relates specifically to high school soccer? The schedule and access to players is unique, and I've been searching and researching resources for the topic.
Not that I know of, and I'm not too familiar with American high school soccer, but my advice would be is the methodology is the methodology. It's the starting point. You know, you still go through the same principles of the methodology and same teachings of the methodology. You know, it's still at the end of the day football, right? It's still football training, which is complex. You know, there's this term that it's not linear, it's complex. You're still talking about game model. You're still talking about collective and individual intentions that are interwoven and synchronized in 90 minutes. You still could design a morpho cycle. Obviously, it's tailored to based on where your games fall. In your exercises, they're still relative to the game model. They're still specific. They're still loads. They're still rich in content. So all that stays the same. And all that you still need to, it's non-negotiable. You still need to take into consideration when you're applying the methodology. But then it comes down to you as a person and you as a coach, and it comes down to your decision making and your emotional load as a coach on how do I figure this out with my schedule of X amount of contact time and X amount of games in a week. I'll just give an example inside the tactical periodization methodology when they do talk about multiple games per week, whether it's 2 or some people have 3 in a week. Your acquisition days are very, very tailored. So there's a lot of recovery, and it unfortunately doesn't give you a lot of time to work specific strength, specific speed, and specific endurance on top of giving an active recovery day. So you, I think, as a coach, have to tailor that in terms of your reality and where everything aligns and how things fall into place. One thing I can relate to definitely, and something that when I went to FC Porto, I tried to explain to the staff there because they're not really familiar with it, is controlling the loads. And I'm sure in high school soccer, just like in amateur club soccer, you don't have control of the players' loads because they're not with you. They're not with you all day, or you don't have all the information. Where when I was in FC Porto, they control all the players' loads, so all of their loads are relatively the same. Whereas in your team or my team, I have 10 player or 15 players. Maybe 5 of them had a physical education class today that they ran a 12-minute run, and the other guy had a lunchtime, I don't know, track and field, and another guy didn't have anything. So your loads are all over the place, which I think is a very, very difficult thing to manage in our society, in our culture, because we're not in control of the loads as much as we try. And different coaches I've spoken to in different clubs really try. So they'll get the physical education plan from their teacher. They'll get their extracurricular plan from their track and field coach or baseball coach or whatever. And they'll take that information and try to do the best they can in terms of tailoring it to their program and to their players. And like I said, maybe all the players don't participate in the full training session. Maybe some of them do half the training session or half the sets, or maybe they take a little bit extra longer recovery. It all depends on your reality, but you still have to take those principles and those non-negotiables of the methodology if you want to apply the methodology into consideration.
Nikki has asked, are you a firm believer of practicing for a certain number of minutes per day relative to the type of session you are running, strength, endurance, recovery, etc.?
So in my experience in tactical periodization application, whether it's me applying or my coaching mentors applying it, the answer would be no, because some days you'll run a session that's 60 minutes. Some days you'll run a session that's 90 minutes. Some days you'll run 75 minutes. And that, again, all gets incorporated into your weekly morpho cycle and your acquisition days. Because based on if you have 2 games in a week, based on the day of, I designed a really, really aggressive strength day, so I'm gonna make it 60 minutes. Maybe we don't have a game this weekend, so maybe my specific endurance day could be a little bit more because we don't have a game on the weekend. So I can maybe push it to, over 90-minute session. Maybe today I need to do 75 minutes because yesterday we did a very aggressive 90 minutes of speed day, and the players are telling me, they're feeling a little bit, so maybe I'll add a little bit more to the recovery, or I'll shorten the session. And I know that drives players sometimes bananas because they'll be like, well, what do you mean 60 minutes today? Why? Yesterday was 90 minutes. But it all comes down to the loads based in your week, and how you use the intensities in each exercise, going from sets, recovery time, the dimensions, the duration, the size, all of those things come into consideration when you're doing that. So my answer would be yeah, and I've done it and seen people applying tactical periodization, that different sessions and different days have different times. Now, some people aren't in the reality of being able to do a 90-minute session. Maybe they only have field time for 1 hour. Those are all constraints that us as people have to overcome and deal with those obstacles in some creative way.
Yeah, the amount of science questions that I'm getting is just unbelievable. Like nobody's asked.
It's very science based, so I understand, because like I explained, I was given a document from that was designed by our coach Paulo Fonseca, who's now a coach in Roma, and he was the understudy of Professor Vitor Frade and came from Porto, and the person who gave it to me sent it to me, and I opened it and it was like 200 pages, and I said, oh my god, this is a lot. My brain is going to be fried. So there is a lot of science component, which is why it's hard to go through the whole methodology in a short webinar. And that's why at the beginning I said I respect the methodology so much, because it's years and years and years of education.
How do you know if, so many games are analyzed today and tactical analysis has gone mainstream? How do you know that someone is, without obviously being told it and without knowing their background, can you watch a match and say that coach there is completely mastered tactical periodization?
No, because when you're watching a game, you're just watching their game model being applied, pretty much. The tactical periodization methodology and component comes throughout the week in your training environment. That's where you're doing the application. That's where you're doing the construction of everything. So the work is coming throughout the week. What you see on the weekend at the game is the game model being applied. And like I said, people can have different game models and put into different systems, so it would be hard. But one thing that maybe you could identify maybe is that throughout the season, there's a clear game model. You can understand that there's clear sub-principles and clear sub-principles and principles is evident. And an example of that is when I did a webinar with Vitor Pereira, he put on a video clip of his game model pretty much and used different clips, all in his different teams. So there was clips from Olympiacos, there was clips from Fenerbahce, there was clips from Shanghai. But the game model was more or less, the principles and sub-principles were the same. For example, in his defensive organization, the pressure was similar. So you could tell that's a Vitor Pereira team right there. Yes, different personnel, maybe a different system, maybe the game models evolved a bit, but it's evident. But to answer that question, I would 99% say no, because the tactical periodization is implemented throughout the week in your training environment.
Yeah, this is interesting. Just to finish up, last couple here, independent newspaper, Miguel Delaney wrote an article yesterday on how Portugal has become Europe's football coach production line. So is that because of, with your experiences in tactical periodization, is that from, and your experiences at Porto, is that because of their they're being drawn towards this methodology, or do you think it's because of the culture in coach education of Portugal, or do you think it's a bit of both?
I think it's a mix of a lot of things. One of the biggest reasons why I grew very fond of the methodology that's comes out in Portugal, and of course the two coaching mentors that have biggest influence in my life are Portuguese. So I was a little bit of bias because it was my development as a coach, and who I still value today as my biggest influences as a coach. Which is what inspired me to learn the language so I can understand their teachings, their literature. And when I went I also visited Vitoria de Setúbal and Académica before I went to Porto, and I grew more and more fond of it just because I saw the success. And people said, well, why you always lean towards Portuguese coaches when you watch things? And I say, because it's the success is there. Like I said, even if you take Jose Mourinho out, who had his fantastic success, there's still people like Paulo Fonseca at Roma, who was successful in Shakhtar before he went. Vitor Pereira, who was successful in Greece and won the title in Shanghai. All over the place, there's people that come from this very small country that have success. And yes, a lot of them were understudies and came through the University of Porto and the teachings of Professor Vitor Frade. So I think that has a huge influence in why they're successful today. But I think it's all sorts of a lot of things. Even if you look, Jorge Jesus, the success he got with Flamengo. I remember when he went to Brazil, they bashed him. They said this guy, he's not from Brazil, blah blah blah, and the way he transformed the club. And how that game they played against River Plate was phenomenal. And then even the game they compete with Liverpool, who has a budget of crazy amounts and world-class players. I think the reason why I study a lot of their coaches and their methodologies because there's this term, the proof is in the pudding. The success is there. You can't deny the success, whether it's player development, players coming through the country, coaches coming through the country, methodology. It's I think it's at the top, and that's why their clubs and their country is recognized for player development and coaching development.
That's the thing that again, just to finish this off, we're running out of time. But we talk a lot about different models, and we've got the Spanish model, and we've got French model, and we've got a lot of player models, but we don't seem to take coach education models. And I always wonder why would it not be. I listened to a podcast this morning with Brendan Rodgers, and he said that when he worked with Chelsea, and funny enough, Mourinho was there. This was 2004, 2005. Steve Clark, Mourinho, Michael Beale came through there as well. Like he said, there was coaches developing at that club that was levels ahead of what was going on. I always wonder why we don't look at a Portuguese model of coach education. I don't know a lot about it. So their culture, is it? You've experienced both. I mean, what does the Portuguese coach education model have that the US doesn't?
When I was there, I tried to get a lot of information on their coach education, and I wasn't really. It was hard to get information on their coach education, even from the coaches that went through it, because to them that's their normal, right? So they just say, "Oh, it's our coach education." But as being an outsider, it was hard to pull information on why it's so successful. But I think their coach education is obviously very detailed in terms of methodology and training structure and player development. And even the coaches, when I was at FC Porto in their academy, and a lot of coaches, and when I was there, my first day, I said, a lot of coaches came through this academy and that's where they started, and that's where they developed. So I think a lot of their development comes not only from coach education, but the real life aspect, the day-to-day they live, from their club technical directors and experienced coaches that they worked with. And, they climbed the ladders in their club, and yes, they go get their coaching licenses. But I think a lot of the work comes from their daily work. That's where the real development comes from, which is why I value a lot going to do these club education internships. I think I've done 5 now in Europe, because I think I value it so much more because it's genuine, it's real. This is the raw, real stuff on how they construct a training exercise for their team to build for the week. This is how their methodology is. This is how they construct a morphocycle. This is the real, genuine stuff. So I think them living that on a daily basis and inside their infrastructure propels them to higher levels.
Yeah, where would you point coaches in a direction in North America to look at clubs or coaches and study?
I think a good resource is Mark Dos Santos at the Vancouver Whitecaps was one of my big coaching mentors, and his brother Philip is his first assistant there. He, like I said, is had many encounters with Professor Vitor Frade, been to Porto many times, studied a lot in tactical periodization methodology, and applies tactical periodization methodology. So that for a fact I know, because we're very close, that methodology is going on there. It might be going on in other clubs as well, that I don't know about, but I know for sure, if we're going to talk about the North American highest level, that's a good place to look, and good place to start is the Vancouver Whitecaps and the work of Mark Dos Santos, who, again, if we want to talk about success with the methodology, NASL Cup final, USL finalist with Swole Park Rangers, San Francisco Delta's NASL, and then Ottawa Fury NASL final against the Cosmos. So there's success there, right? And he worked with Bob Bradley at LAFC in their first season. So the success at LAFC, obviously being a part of the team there, is a contributing factor. But I think if we're gonna look on this side, he's one to, or there, the Vancouver Whitecaps and Mark is someone to look at.
Brilliant. Fantastic. You mentioned there at the start that this was such a big topic that you couldn't really get into it, and I just feel like an hour we haven't even scratched the surface, so it's just flown. So, we'll hopefully get you on again at some point, Jay. Like I can't appreciate your contribution enough. This has been fantastic.
Anytime. Thank you for having me, and we can do a part 2, a part 3, and divulge in more, and I'm sure a part 88 with the detail of this methodology and growth of my understanding of the methodology. So
superb. Thanks, Jay. Be safe. We'll talk soon.
Thank you very much.
All right. All the best.